So it's that time of year here on BookTube where we start doing our end of the year content, and I'm going to start off strong here with the best new to me authors this year. One of my goals for this year in 2024 was to try and read a bunch of new authors, and I didn't realize how well I actually did at that goal until I went and looked at my spreadsheet and kept that where I keep track of everything. And so out of the 50-ish novels I've read, I pretty sure that's about correct, 24 of them were new to me authors. If you want to count graphic novels and nonfiction, that actually bumps up to 28 out of 54-ish books were completely new to me authors, which is pretty incredible. And so this is kind of the cream of the crop. And we're actually going to go ahead and start off here with the first author. We're going to go in order of how many books I read by that author. And the first one is actually me completely cheating because I'm actually going to put Stephen King on this list. I actually read It back in 2022. And at the time, I thought it was a good book. I enjoyed it. But this year, King has been an absolute revelation for me. I read 5 books by him this year, which was The Shining, Salem's Lot, Pet Sematary, Cujo, and Misery. And I had such an amazing time with all of those books. It really opened my eyes to King as a writer, and he absolutely deserves a spot on this list, even though technically I read It back in 2022. Just what he was able to do with those stories, how he's able to pull me into those books. A couple of them in particular you're going to see later on my top 10 books of the year sometime in December. King just, absolutely, he's skyrocketed into my favorite authors of all time list. He has just been something that I'm so glad that I got to experience this year, and I'm really looking forward to continuing my journey with him next year. At some point I will get around to The Dark Tower. There's maybe a few other books I want to read from him first, maybe The Stand, maybe 11/22/63, and I have a whole video about like the next Stephen King books I want to read. So those will probably be the ones I want to get to first before starting The Dark Tower. But as a new to me author this year, absolutely a revelation, and I'm so glad that I read him. Okay, and now for some actually new to me authors. I just really had to mention Stephen King there. Next up with 3 books read is Steven Erikson, and those are the first 3 books of Malazan Book of the Fallen, Gardens of the Moon, Dead House Gates, and then Memories of Ice. And Erikson is absolutely an extremely talented writer. I actually really enjoy his writing, and it's interesting that he's on this list because Dead House Gates in particular, I had a pretty difficult time with. But through the entire time, it wasn't the writing itself that bothered me. I think he is an immense storyteller. I think the world he's building in Malazan is probably on a tier on its own. I think there's going to be so many things that I don't even understand unless I did an entire reread of the series once I finished it, that going back from book 1 all the way to book 10, there's just stuff I won't even get. And I think when you look at that as a reader and like the appreciation I have for that from the author, it is just next level. I will say I think he does so many things well, characters, politics, magic, which, the magic system hasn't even really been explained to me yet, but just kind of throwing me to the wolves, making me experience this world, and his writing has just been a fantastic thing, and I look forward to, again, continuing him in 2025. I had originally planned on reading a lot more of Malazan Book of the Fallen in 2024, and I'll be honest, those books just take a long time for me to read, and that is kind of why I haven't gotten around to the next one, House of Chains yet, but that might be the next long book I read once I finish Wind and Truth here in December, whenever that comes out. I really am starting to feel that pull back to Malazan, and that's kind of when I know it's a good time to read it. That's kind of what I did with Memories of Ice. I waited until I wanted to read it again after that little bit of a struggle I had with Dead House Gates. And yeah, once again, as a new to me author, this Malazan experience has been pretty impressive so far, and I'm sure it only continues to soar as we go from here. Next up on this list is another fantasy author, and that is Jay Kristoff. So I read both of the Empire of the Vampire books, so that's Empire of the Vampire and Empire of the Damned. I actually don't know the name for this trilogy, and I am very much anticipating the last book in this trilogy. I think this world, the world building and the characters are just really fantastic. It's really what put me over the edge here. I think the way the story is told is also something that is a literary device that just works for me. We have somebody who is writing about past deeds. They're in a situation where they're kind of recanting their tales and telling somebody about what has happened in their past, and that is the way it is done in here is pretty masterfully done. I really enjoyed it. I also think the world and the magics that are kind of explored through here are really well done. Obviously, he's on this list for a reason. I do like he has a pretty brutal and dark world with still like bits of hope and love. And I really think that is something I didn't expect to enjoy so much from these books, but there is this just aspect of like care and love, and like there's almost a Geralt Ciri relationship here in these books, and I didn't think that is something I would really, not you Ciri, and I didn't really think that, is it Ciri or Cersei? I think it's Ciri, but you know, it's not something I really thought that I was going to be drawn to when I was reading these books, but the more I read it, the more I appreciated it. And there are some other things, there are some other aspects of it here, specifically the action, that the way he writes it, I think is really well done. It feels like impactful and just so many things. Once again, really excited to read more from him. I know he has another trilogy that I've heard more mixed things about, the Nevernight trilogy, but it's kind of one that I want to try. I think it's interesting that it's a series that has a lot of footnotes. And I read this Barnabas trilogy when I was a kid, and it is full of like footnotes of like what the characters are thinking at that specific time, and you like would read that paragraph and go down to them. And I'm pretty sure that's the same thing with the Nevernight trilogy, so I kind of maybe want to try that out. But he's another author who has just been a great experience so far this year, and I'm looking forward to reading more from him. Next up, we will talk about a sci-fi author, and I only read one book from the rest of these authors, so it's maybe a little bit bold to put it on here, but it just really means that I liked the books that they wrote. And the first person up here is Robert Silverberg, and this is the book I read from him this time, was A Time of Changes. And this is a book that has really stuck with me more than I thought it would. There are definitely some very interesting elements about it, which makes me really curious to read more of his stuff. There are some, the only way I can really describe it is, and I've never done drugs or anything, but like a psychedelic experience from the way that it's described in the media and all kinds of things. This book gets trippy. The character, I think, I think they legitimately either eat or smoke something, and they kind of transcend to a different plane and end up really connecting with people in a way that is just really strange. And also there's a literary device in this book where the idea of I, the self, is seen as a bad thing. And so you are going to see some very specific instances of certain words used at very specific times that have a real big impact to a story. And this is one of those books that I never really even thought about, like the structure of a book in this way. And this is one of those books that really opened me to the idea of like how a specific word can be used and have such a huge impact on a story. And I think it was just masterfully done. And so I'm really curious on what else Silverberg has out there. I plan on reading, I think the next one is Nightwings, maybe? I think I have that one. And I'm just curious on if he is as creative and explorative with language in those books and kind of the ideas that he has. I feel like he might be kind of out there with some of the ideas that he touches and explores with, and I think that is a really fascinating thing to deal with. Next up on this list is Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon. That is the only book I have read from him so far, but I cannot wait to finish this trilogy, the Five Warrior Angels trilogy. This book was just a kick-ass book the entire time through. It's like a heavy metal Game of Thrones fantasy or old school fantasy inspired story. You have some of the traditional tropes, but this is also a very grimdark book, and I think it just is amazing. The battles are good. There's one or two little things with this book that annoyed me, and outside of that, I think this is one of the best books I read this year. One of my favorite new authors going forward. I really hope we get something outside of the Five Warrior Angels trilogy. I actually don't know how it ends, so maybe there could be more in that world, but I would love to hear that Brian Lee Durfee is writing something else, and so we will see. But once again, very excited to get to The Blackest Heart here sometime in 2025. It's really high up on my list. It's honestly probably going to push something like Malazan or The Wars of Light and Shadow by Janie Wirtz or some other series that I'm thinking about trying, because I just so desperately want to read The Blackest Heart and then The Lonesome Crown here very, very soon. Next up on this list is actually an author that I just recently read and was completely blown away from, and that is Karen Lwochi. I'm not 100% sure I said that correctly, but I read one book from this author. I think they only have this one book out, and that is The Mountain Crown. And this is a very short, I think the audiobook was like 3 hours long or something like that. And this is a book that does what most books wish they could do in 150-ish pages, 105-ish pages. I can't remember the exact actual page count because I listened to it, but it accomplishes so much that a book that would take 600 pages to normally do. And I think that is what I'm most impressed from this author. She was able to get me invested into characters, invested into a world, and invested into the struggle that is going on here, while also layering in world building in a way that makes sense and is very consumable. And so I'm just blown away once again. I have traditionally stayed away from shorter works. And this year that is something I definitely moved away from. I started to read some more shorter stuff. And so this was supposed to just kind of be a filler to read before Wind and Truth came out. And I actually ended up reading it super quick because it was so good. This is one of my biggest surprises of the year. And I'm so glad I read it. I'm very much anticipating the next book that comes in this. It looks like it's going to be a trilogy, and I think they're all going to be kind of on the shorter side. So I very much want to see what is going to happen there. But blown away by this, blown away by the writing, writing. And like I said, what this author was able to do in a very limited page count is something most authors would take 500 to 600 pages to do, and they might not even do it as well as they were able to here. And so I was immensely blown away and very much looking forward to reading more in 2025. And then the last author I have on this list is maybe also a cheat, because I think I may have read this when I was in school, but it was so long ago I didn't really want to count it. I made a goal this year of reading at least one nonfiction book, and because I never read nonfiction, and so I actually ended up reading A Narrative of a Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. And this is just such a well done written book. And obviously the subject matter that it covers is horrible. It's horrific. It's the blackest stain on America's history, all of those things. But I think it is beautifully written. I think it tells his story, so well. It's not, once again, it is not something that is very long, but I just think it's something that, this is one of the few books I think that everybody should read. And I don't say that lightly, but I think it is just such an important book to look at history, to see how things were, and to see this person's arc. And he is an author who, I think he has 2 other autobiographies about his experience, and I think some of that ends up going later in life. As he got older, he kind of rewrote the early parts of his slavery, and then maybe some of his later life as a free man, and then kind of did that 2 more times. And so those are definitely 2 novels that I would want to read at some point. Maybe next year I'll bump it up and say I want to read 2 nonfiction books, and maybe I'll read both of them. They do get a little bit progressively longer, so this is definitely the one that I would push people towards to read and experience. But once again, another person who I just have an immense amount of respect for, not just as an author, but as a person, and definitely kind of want to experience more of their writing. I don't know, I think because he was heavily involved in some politics and stuff, I don't know if he has maybe some letters or things that are more revolved around policy and stuff at the time. That's maybe something I'll look into as well, just because I would like to read a little bit of that, because I'm kind of a history nerd, especially when it comes to American history. So reading some of that stuff is always a little bit interesting to me. But those are my kind of top tier new authors to me. Like I said, I read a lot more than this year, but I would love to know any new authors that you read this year that really stuck out. If you kind of just stuck with your tried and true authors, I'd like to know that as well. Just let me know any of that down below in the comments. But that's all for me, and as always, have a good one.